Hi, welcome back. Today we're gonna have a brief introduction into what management is. Okay, let's start by defining management. Management is actually a process, so it's something that it's always ongoing, and it's a process that it's trying to achieve basically the organizational objectives. Okay, and by using essentially the resources that are at the disposal of the firm, both effectively and efficiently, and take into consideration what the changing factors are within the environment of the firm. Okay, so let's try to break that down and see if we can actually understand. So like I said, first, it's a process, and by being a process is something that never gets done, that it's always ongoing, right? And it's going to be a function of the objectives that we set up for the organization. As we know, and we're going to talk more in detail later about how to set objectives, but as we know, as a firm, uh, one of the key goals is going to be profit. So it's not the only goal, and we're going to have to look at the mission statement of the firm to really determine what other objectives are actually reasonable, right? And how are we going to achieve those objectives? Well, by trying to use the resources at our disposal. And first, we need to talk about efficiency and efficacy. So, two different things: efficiency versus efficacy. Let's talk about efficacy first. Effectively using something means that you actually achieve that goal that is set up in some way. Like, for example, if your goal is to earn a profit of $100 million, being effective means actually getting there to the 100 million. Now, effectivity is particularly important because obviously otherwise the goals are not achieved. So, but that's just the minimum, it's a minimum requirement. The other thing that could be important is efficiency. Efficiency is essentially when we're looking at achieving those $100 million with the minimum number of resources. So it's not just achieving the goal, but it's achieving the goal without wasting resources. And that means people, time, and money, essentially, in the case of a firm. And who's going to be conducting this function, this process, the management is going to be the managers, obviously, because it's about the people that are getting the work done. The firm doesn't do anything on its own. So the key role within management is going to be played by the manager. The manager has essentially four functions that they have to undertake within the firm: planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. And these are going to show up in different mixes depending on where the manager is located. Top level manager is going to spend most of the time, as we will see later, in planning, whereas line manager is going to be a lot more time spending time controlling and directing workers. Okay, so let's talk about what kind of things management is going to be doing. What are the kind of activities that they are going to undertake? So one of the key factors that managers are in charge of is staffing, which is essentially the function that tries to obtain talent, labor, people, essentially, that have the right skills for the right jobs. So hiring people is one of the key functions that managers are going to be in charge of. Also, unfortunately, sometimes if the firm is not doing well or the conditions change, like we can see now, unfortunately, with this pandemic that we're facing right now, you might have to downsize the size of the firm, the amount of people that work in the firm, and that is also a function that needs to be undertaken, even though it's not pleasant, by managers. Okay. Other than staffing, another key activity is ensure that you have the right suppliers to complete your job. So if you're manufacturing something, you actually need the right suppliers that will provide you with the materials that you actually need for that function. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to complete the products. The same thing happens with the service. Obviously, firms use all sort of services. It could be a consulting service where you get help. For example, if you're working on a product development process and you need some technical assistance from the outside, there's also our suppliers for you. It's not only about parts, it could also be services. Another important aspect, other than acquiring suppliers, is obtaining the right financial resources, right? So for us within the firm to really be able to function at all, especially if you're talking about a small firm, but even large firms, as we will see, Boeing is going through this right now. You need financial resources so that you can actually survive. So most small firms fail not because their products are not attractive, but because they do not have sufficient cash in hand to face the payments that they actually need to make in the short term, even though maybe they will be able to be successful and profitable in the medium and long term, but they never make it there. This could also happen with a large corporation, right? So Boeing, if you look at the news right now, they're struggling. They've had serious problems because of the difficulties they had with the 737, and this is an ongoing saga that has been running for about 6 months now, and the company is bleeding money, literally. And of course, the impact that the coronavirus is having in the environment, especially in the airlines, is only making it worse. So I think now they've asked the government for a bailout. So financial resources are essential for the company to function. Let's discuss in some more detail these management functions that we have mentioned before. So let's start with planning. So planning, as I have discussed before briefly, it's essentially setting up the objectives that we're going to try to achieve as a firm. And more importantly, well, I don't know if more importantly, but at least as importantly, try to also describe the actions that are going to be undertaken to actually achieve those objectives. And remember that planning is also a process like management, and the fact that you're seriously thinking about objectives and how to achieve them, it's just the act itself, it's going to help a lot with management organization. Even though most plans to some degree or another fail, in fact, there are a few famous sayings when it comes down to this. One is that plans are worthless, but plan is everything, like you have here from General Eisenhower. And another one is that plans never survive first contact with the enemy. So, but that doesn't mean that planning is not important. It's a very, very essential function. Otherwise, if you don't know where you're going, every route will take you there, right? So you need to have a clear direction, and that clear direction is going to be given by this planning process, by setting objectives and determining how they're going to be accomplished. Now, within this planning process, one of the essential aspects is determining the mission of the company. And this is the identity of the firm. I have here a couple of mission statements from companies that you know well. I have Apple's, for example, which it says, and this is from Tim Cook. I think he gave this speech in 2009. So it's been a few years, but I think it's telling of what Apple has been trying to do in the last few years. It says that their mission is to bring the best user experience to its customers through its innovative hardware, software, and services. Notice that he doesn't only talk about things, but he also talks about services, which have become a key pillar for Apple. And I think it's going to be even more so as their new product development is going to slow down. And then I have Tesla's, which I even like better because it's focused on benefits. It's not focused on the actual things that they're going to do to achieve that. Even though Apple's is kind of vague, and because of that, it's very encompassing. And notice their mission statement for Tesla is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. It doesn't say anything about cars, which I find fascinating. So this is what the company is trying to achieve. And cars are just the tool to get there. Okay. Now, other than the mission statement, which is going to set the overarching direction for the organization, and it's essential, but it's something that is really long term. We need to talk about goals and objectives. The book makes a big distinction between these two, but I honestly don't see much of a difference because the book says that objectives are more measurable. I think goals should be measurable. I think that's one of the key characteristics of a good goal or objective. So I'm going to require for an objective or a goal to be good, it needs to be measurable. You need to be able to tell me whether you actually got there or not. And the only way to do that is if you can measure something. And of course, when I'm talking about being measurable, you're going to have to come up with a metric sometimes. Some of these are already things that you need to do. Like, for example, you're going to have to do accounting within the organization because you need to pay taxes. So the IRS is going to ask you to measure what your sales are. and what your profits are, because that's going to depend. I mean, the taxes you pay are going to be a function of those two figures. On the other hand, if you decide that one of the key objectives for your organization is customer satisfaction, if you want to make sure that your customers are satisfied, you're going to have to come up with metrics that enable you to tell measurably in numbers whether people are satisfied or not. So whether you use a survey or any other tool for that matter, if you're setting objectives or goals in terms of satisfaction, you need to have an actual metric that comes with it. Other than measurable, another thing that needs to happen is the objective needs to be concrete. So just saying that you want to improve satisfaction, it's not a good objective. A good objective will look like if you are measuring satisfaction in a, let's say, 7-point scale, and your last recorded average satisfaction was 6 on a 1 to 7 scale, improving satisfaction by 2 decimal points, so moving from 6 to 6.2, that will be our goal. Okay, that is a concrete goal. So this way you know if you have actually achieved it or not. If you just make general statements like, oh, we want to improve, improvement, there is small improvement, medium-sized improvement, and really large improvement. How do you know whether you've gotten there unless you make your objective concrete? Another thing that is also important when it comes down to objectives is making sure that the objective is time-bound. What do I mean by this? Okay, we're going to improve our satisfaction score by 2 decimal points in 3 months. Okay, so from the time that the plan is written, within 3 months, this improvement needs to be realized. If you do not make objectives time-bound, if you say we just need to do it, a year later, nothing has happened, but you're still within your plan because, of course, you didn't set a time or a deadline for your objective, and that is actually necessary. Okay, what else? The last one, and this is not necessarily a requirement for a good objective, the first three are, these are the 3 characteristics of good objectives, but this is in practice a useful tip, which is try to make your objectives ambitious but obtainable. What do I mean by this? Well, if you require an improvement that is beyond the scope of what is achievable by people, like for example, if you ask your salespeople to increase their sales by 30% in a 3-month span, which is unlikely to happen unless you've been doing things really wrong beforehand, that is an extremely ambitious objective, and it's so ambitious that it will make people give up. It's essentially so ambitious that it's unattainable. On the other hand, if you ask your salespeople to increase their sales by 5% in a 3-month span, which is an ambitious objective as well, it may be within reach of at least the good salespeople within your sales force. And that making it ambitious will push people in the right direction. So making something ambitious in terms of objectives is actually good. It motivates people, but making objectives that are too ambitious will just create the opposite effect. It will make people give up because they know they are not going to be able to achieve their objectives. Now, continuing with the planning, let's talk about the different types of plans. So the planning is actually a process, but there are different types of plan, and they mostly vary by the term of the plan. So the strategic plans are mostly long-term plans that are set up usually by upper management that dictate how that mission of the company is going to be achieved. Okay, tactical plans, they are essentially the translation of these strategic plans into a medium or maybe shorter term. It depends. The time frame is going to be dependent on the industries. There are some industries that are moving really fast, like in technology. We're talking in years, and maybe it's not reasonable because the pace of change is pretty fast. Whereas in the case of building airplanes, like we were talking about Boeing before, and building a long-term plan, you're probably talking about 15 plus years because designing and producing a new plane takes years, at least 5 to 7 years from the moment you start deciding on the design to the moment you can actually deliver one of the planes. But this is not true in technology space. So when I'm talking about long-term versus medium-term versus short-term, this kind of varies from industry to industry. So we have long-term for strategic plans, medium-term, I cannot make an M here, medium term for tactical plans, and operational plans are short term. Okay, so short term And what is short term? This could be months or even weeks. So this is the exact same actions that are going to be translated from the medium term plans to the shorter plans. What needs to get done right away so that we can get into that mid and long term planning. Okay. Now, other than planning, another important function of managers is organizing. And organizing is essentially about setting up structures within the organization that enable things to happen, right? Structuring all the resources and activities basically to achieve the goals. So one of the key parts of structure within the organization is the lines of authority, is the organigram of the firm. Who's going to be in charge of what and who reports to who and how that communication flow is going to move from the top of the firm to the workers and from the workers to the top management. Okay. So all this structure that we set up, it's going to enable many things, but one of the key aspects is going to be communication and the flow of information. Okay. Hopefully also it avoids duplication of resources, so that way you don't need to have two people dedicated to do the same job in different parts of the organization where that is actually not necessary. Okay. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to be able to react quickly to changes in the environment and speed up the decision-making process by just creating structures that enable you to do it. The next function that managers need to undertake, like we've mentioned, is directing. Now, what is directing? Directing is essentially telling people what to do and when to do it. So we were talking about objectives before and what actions we need to undertake to achieve those objectives. Directing is essentially assigning those actions to specific people, so telling different people what they are going to be working on and also when they are going to be working on it. Now, to achieve that, motivation is very important. You can't just tell people what to do. You need to give a good reason why they should be working on it. So they need to be motivated. And oftentimes you need to lead by example. So if you are asking people, for example, to be more transparent and to communicate more, you as a manager are going to have to be doing the same thing so that you lead by example. Okay. Now, how are we going to also help not only motivating, but another important aspect of this is going to be incentives, right? So how do you get people to do something? Well, one school of thought, and it's not the only one, is that people do what they get paid to do. So incentives, both monetary and non-monetary incentives, like telling people that they do a good job when they indeed do it. They play a key role in making sure that you have productive workers that are actually achieving the goals that you are interested in getting done. Okay. And also it might be useful to get them to get more involved in the organization and hence contribute ideas for improvement. Okay, and then the last aspect of management is this idea of controlling. Now, what are you going to be controlling? What you're going to be doing is essentially evaluating that the objectives that you have set up actually getting accomplished. Like you might actually have intermediate milestones that need to be achieved, and so the objectives get uh, accomplished. To do that, you're going to have to evaluate performance from individual workers and individual actions. And if there is a deviation or a deviance between the objectives that you have set up and the milestones that you're observing because you're evaluating performance, there needs to be corrective action, right? So if we're moving in the wrong direction, we need to let people know that they are not doing either the things that we were asking them to do or when we were asking them to do them, right? To make sure that they can actually take the right steps to move back into the right direction. So the way we do this systematically is first by measuring performance. If you're not measuring it, you cannot manage it. So you need to measure. And for that, you need to define the metrics and those need to be agreed upon. Then after measuring, what you need to do is you need to basically make sure that there are clear standards of uh, objectives. So what are you trying to achieve? So if you are measuring satisfaction and incentives are paid based on satisfaction, there needs to be a clear idea of how high customer satisfaction need to be for example, a salesperson to get that extra incentive. Okay. Then if there are the next step is if you see that there is a difference between the standard that you have set up or the objectives that you have set up for the metrics that you are measuring. If there are any deviations from the standards, you need to identify those areas and try to understand why there is a deviation. For example, if there are lower sales in an industry for some of your salespeople, the question is it because the salesperson is not doing the right thing? Or are the lower sales because of an external factor that maybe the salesperson cannot control? Like, for example, right now, in some industries, like for example, tourism, things are pretty difficult because nobody's traveling. So because of that, regardless of how good of a job a salesperson will do, even though we observe a deviation between the objective that we had in terms of sales in our maybe in our hotel and the figures that we are seeing, maybe the reason why that's happening is not because of the salesperson performance. So we need to understand why that deviation occurs. And if we think that it's because of something that the salesperson is doing in that case, what we need to do is undertake and outline corrective actions that will enable us to get back on track. Maybe they're doing a great job and it's out of their hands, then just keep doing what they are doing. Now we're going to make a distinction between the different levels of management. We have top management at the top of the hierarchy, which are essentially C-level executives and maybe some executive vice presidents. So these are the people that are usually working in the long-term plans for the firm, and they set the overall direction of the organization. Then you have middle management, which are still can be pretty high up management, but they are usually in charge of smaller parts of the organization. So, for example, it could be something like a divisional manager. So the company might have multiple divisions, and the manager that is in charge, or the managers that are in charge of a division, will be middle level management. And then we have first line of management. These are usually managers that are in direct contact with workers. And what we're going to describe in the next few slides is how these different managers require different skills and what kind of actions are they usually under. Okay, top management, like I was mentioning before, it's going to be composed of a few managers. It's usually a small group. So you will have the CEO of the organization and then maybe other C-level executives like the CFO, CMO, etc. Okay. And then other than that, there might be, depending on the organization, a few executive vice presidents, but that's it. So it's a select small group, and what their key function is going to be is A, setting up the mission of the organization, and then the long-term planning of the organization. So their key function for the most part is going to be around planning. So what objectives are we trying to achieve as an organization, and how are we going to get there? Okay. One of the aspects that can be somewhat controversial within these top level executives, it's their compensation. So here in the next slide, I have some of the top executives, how much they get paid. Here you have some compensation figures for some of the top CEOs in the US. And as you can see, they are making quite a bit of money. So for example, here you have Tim Cook, who is the CEO of Apple, right? And he has the highest compensation package in this chart, and some people will consider this to be excessive, but you need to understand that first, these compensation packages have a salary plus incentives, and those incentives are going to be essentially a function of how well the firm is doing, and so they're going to be tied to the stock price of the firm. So if Tim Cook does a good job as a CEO and it achieves growth in the firm, meaning their sales keep growing. They grow faster than what Wall Street was thinking or planning or forecasting that was going to happen. What's going to happen with their stock price for Apple is that it's going to go up. And as it does, Tim Cook is going to be able to get larger and larger incentive packages. So a lot of these compensation packages have a really large part that is a function of the performance of the firm. So they do get paid a lot of money because they make a lot of money for the firm. This is equivalent to LeBron James making a lot of money uh, on his own, but he also makes a lot of money for the LA Lakers, right? Then after top management, we have middle management. So the idea of middle management is they are supposed to translate those overarching plans that top management has laid out, and they have to make them concrete and workable for the people that work under them. So for example, if you are a plant manager, then you will be considered middle management. So you need to translate the plans that top management has created for the entire organization and how those apply to the plant that you are in charge of. Okay. So the responsibility of middle management is to create essentially the tactical plans that will be making or will be describing the actions that need to be undertaken so that those big picture plans that top management has created can actually indeed happen at a smaller scale within the organization. Okay, so the responsibility is going to be essentially more narrowly focused than in the case of top management. They are still going to be in charge of doing some planning, but they are going to be focusing mostly on organizing. Okay, and then they'll do some directing too, etc. Right, but their key point is they'll do some planning. That planning is going to be translating those big plans, and they are going to basically creating the structure within their part in the firm that they are in charge of, and the processes in place to enable those actions to actually happen. And they're going to be translating what top management has basically outlined to their uh, area of authority or expertise. Now, then we have first line uh, management. And first line management are going to spend most of their time directing and controlling workers. So their job, it's not so much to lay out the plans, but to make sure that the plans that have been laid out by middle management get actually done. They get accomplished. So they are in charge of making sure that the workers are getting the degree of performance that is required by the goals that you have set up. And to do that, they need to be doing some directing and some controlling. So they're going to be measuring performance, evaluating performance, and making sure that if it's needed, correction action is actually taken. Okay. So here you have in a chart what I just described in the slides before. As you can see, top management is gonna basically spend most of the time planning, setting up long-term objectives, and obviously there is some part of structuring the organization that is going to enable those long-term plans, right? So if there needs to be a merger, for example, top management is going to be the one that is going to be in charge of that. And so if you need some skill set or some assets that are not part of the organization at this point, that will be top management's aspect, but they are not going to be doing the controlling for the most part. Okay. On the other hand, as you can see, you have middle management, which is going to be doing some planning because they need to, like I said, translate the plans from top management to their areas of authority and influence, which usually is more narrowly focused and smaller. But they also, for the most part, are going to spend their time organizing, so setting up the structure so that the objectives actually get done. And then finally, you have first line managers, which spend most of their time directing and controlling. So they just take the plans and objectives that come from middle managers and they just make them happen. And to do that, you're going to have to direct people, motivate, and make sure that the incentives are aligned. Now, I've been talking so far about management in general, as though, it's just one big family, but at the end of the day, there are different types of managers, right? So we have financial managers that focus mostly in the organization having the right resources to manage money efficiently within the organization. We have operations managers, which are in charge of all the activities that take the inputs into the organization and they achieve uh, the outputs, which could be either goods, services, or solutions, right? So they take the inputs and they just make sure that those inputs are transformed into what the firm actually offers in the marketplace, whether it's a product or a service. We also have human resource managers, which are the ones that handle staffing decisions with the organization. That will include things like hiring people, training people, and it also includes, unfortunately, getting rid of or firing people. Then you have marketing manager, which is responsible usually for the design of the products or services, their pricing, and any communication that comes from the customer side. So making sure that those products have the input of the customer and also the customer knows about the product through advertising, promotions, etc. You're also going to have information technology managers, which are in charge of all the IT within the organization, such as computer networks or anything else that is connected within the organization. And you're going to have also administrative managers, which are just general purpose managers and that do not specialize in any specific. So what kind of skills do these managers need? Well, they are gonna need some technical skills. So, for example, if you are a finance manager, you're gonna have to have a deep understanding of finance, and so the technical aspects related to the function that you're in charge of within the organization needs to be there. But you also need some conceptual skills. So you need to have a deep understanding of business, and not only of your technical areas that enable you to make the decisions that are about your area of expertise within the context of the organization. You also need to have some analytical skills. So you need to be able to look at a situation, collect facts, and then based on those facts, which could be numbers or not, make some decisions. We'll describe how decision making can be undertaken within organizations in a systematic manner in a few slides. And then you, because you're working within the organization and you're working with people, you need to have some good human relation skills. You need to have a human touch. You're going to be communicating information to people and maybe some of the decisions made by the organizations and, and having a human touch is particularly important, especially if you're working directly with workers. Okay. So a key essential aspect of good managers is leadership. And leadership is essentially the ability for the manager to influence employees in a way that will make them more likely to achieve the goal that they have been set up within the organization. So if you think about it, uh, there is a little bit of an innate quality to this, but there are a couple of aspects that are important within leadership. And so how you become a good manager? Well, let me go through a few tips. First is start with clear standards and expectations. If people don't know what they need to achieve, they will never get there, right? So communication is particularly essential, and communication of standards and expectations for the different employees need to be there. So you need to start by telling people what it is that you want from them clearly but kindly. Okay. Then next step is try to gain their trust. And how do you achieve their trust? Oftentimes by being a role model, by undertaking the same behavior that you're asking from them. So any expectation that you have of your employees conceptually, you should have a higher standard for yourself. So if you ask people to stay 8 hours on the job, you should be on the job for more than 8 hours because otherwise people will think that you're talking about one thing but not doing it yourself. So leading by example is one of the absolutely most powerful things you can actually do. Another important aspect of leading is empowering employees, right? This idea that you give them an idea or clear expectation of what they should be doing, but also you lead them some decision making power. So if you're asking them to improve customer satisfaction, for example, you need to give them tools that enable them to affect that customer satisfaction by making their own decisions about what they can do to make that customer happier, right? So they need to feel like they are a part of the decision-making process, and they need to have true leeway into what's going to happen. Otherwise, they will feel demotivated and they'll give up. Okay, and obviously, an important aspect of this is make sure that your incentives are aligned. So if you're talking about customer satisfaction, customer satisfaction, customer satisfaction, then don't go ahead and give incentives based on sales. The incentives should be set based on customer satisfaction. Okay, so your rewards need to be aligned with the expectations that you're setting up, and make sure that you have a clear path for allowing people to get a corrective action, so that they know that even if they deviate from the path, you will help them actually get in the right direction to be successful within the firm. And finally, let's outline how managers should be making decisions within the organization. So let me start with the overall process, and then I'll break it down into each of the different steps. So the first step is to recognize that there is a situation that requires some sort of decision. This could be a negative or a positive situation. And then find and sometimes create options or alternatives that you could actually undertake. Okay, then evaluate those options, try to decide which one is the best, decide on which of those options seems to be the most appealing one or the most likely one to work. Then work on an implementation plan. Okay, now that we know which action we need to take, who's going to be doing what, and when is it going to happen. That's the implementation of the decision. And then monitor the consequences. Make sure that you have some metrics that are going to tell you whether you achieved the goals that you set up. So let's talk about each of the steps a little bit more in detail. So the first part is defining the decision situation, right? So this could arise because of both positive or negative situations. So what do I mean by negative? I think everybody sees that part, right? So if you have a change in the environment, that could actually be a threat to us. So for example, if you are a company like Delta, right now with the whole coronavirus spread, you're going to have to restructure your organization quite a bit. You might have to scale down on the flights, right? So the decision situation needs to be defined by management as to, what does the coronavirus mean for Delta, right? So they need to have a clear idea of, for example, are we talking about making operational cutbacks? Are we talking about maybe laying off people? Or if not laying off people, what kind of things can we do within the organizations to mitigate the impact, right? But, the same coronavirus in a different organization could actually pose a positive situation. Of course, it's not positive for society, but if you are Netflix, for example, you need to start thinking about how to actually restructure some of your network capabilities, maybe because your demand is a lot higher this week, for example, than it will have been in the last few years. Okay, so that increase in demand for your product, it's another situation that you need to actually consider and think about what kind of decisions you're going to have to undertake. Notice that oftentimes, but not always, small scale problems or situations tend to occur quickly and without much warning, but usually the large scale decisions that shape up industries and change things dramatically usually have warning signs. So speaking of Netflix, and Netflix is a company that now dominates the content space, but a few years ago they were just a startup, right? Actually, even a small firm, and oftentimes incumbents do not see those warning signs. So Blockbuster, who was the key competitor of Netflix early on, when Netflix was a DVD service, not a content streaming service like it is now. And Blockbuster did not look at those warning signs. There is an interview, very interesting interview a few years back with the CEO of Blockbuster saying that Netflix was for nerds, right? Look who's watching now, sorry, who's laughing now. Actually, Netflix offered their company to Blockbuster in two occasions to be bought, and the CEO refused. And in the end, Blockbuster went bankrupt because Netflix took over the market. But these large scale decisions um, are usually heated up by warning signs. The problem is your organization listening to the warning signs. So to do that, you're going to have systems in place that enable you to understand what's happening in the environment. Okay, then after we have defined the decision that we are trying to undertake, and then what we're going to do is we're going to develop the options. Now, options are the things that we are going to do, the actions, the things, the scenarios basically that we're going to try to achieve in terms of goals. And this could be standard things, like for example, if you're talking about increasing sales of a company, this could be something like doing more advertising or increasing the sales force. So those will be standard ideas, right? But sometimes you need to come up with also, in fact, not sometimes, most of the times, a good idea to include them into the options is coming up with something creative. So instead of just doing the standard set of decisions, why don't you just brainstorm, right? Why don't you try to come up with new things? Think of wild scenarios. At this stage, when you're just developing the options, it is okay to be creative. It is okay to be risky, right? Later, you'll have to assess how big of that risk you're willing to take on. But at this point, when you're developing the options, coming up with wild cards is actually a good idea. Okay? Next, after you've developed your options, you need to analyze those options, right? You need to just try to come up with metrics, right? And metrics could be a yes, no. Is this something that technically is feasible, right? Is it a practical solution, right? So if one of the options you have come up with is to develop a new product for which the technology doesn't exist, is that a practical thing to be done within the time frame that this decision is to be made, right? Also, will the options that you have considered or created, are they going to reappropriate to tackle the decision that you are actually interested in, right? The one that we have defined before. Okay? Um, Next, after we have analyzed the different options, now what we need to do is we need to come up with what is the best of the different options that we have developed, right? And this could be based on concrete metrics, but at the end of the day, oftentimes it tends to be somewhat subjective. And the reason why is because oftentimes you're going to have to do a trade-off of the risks and potential rewards that are going to come from each of the different options that you are considering. And plus, a lot of the information that you have at this point is going to be tentative and it's going to be based on things like forecasts. So it's tricky to come up with decisions always based on hard data. Although whenever you can use hard data, you'll be better off doing so. Okay. Even it's based on forecast. After you have selected what the best option is, at least given what information you have at this point, then what you need to do is you need to come up with a plan to implement that decision. Okay. And the plan can be a simple thing. It could be just what we need to do is just change the price. So all we need to do is just change the price. That is a simple decision. Or it could be very complex. It might require developing a new product, or it might require acquiring a set of skills that we don't actually have within the organization so that we can actually achieve something. That might require hiring new people, and it maybe might require some training, etc., etc. So it really depends on the decision that you have undertaken, and it's a function of what you came up with when you were creating your options. Right? And be ready for all these plans not to actually work properly and oftentimes have unexpected consequences, right? So, you've decided to launch a new product, and because of that, maybe the product fails, but not only the product fails, but there are negative consequences that impact your plan, right? Which is maybe
a bigger ordeal, right? Something that you didn't consider was going to happen actually does happen, right? And by the way, unexpected consequences could be positive or negative, but you usually prepare more for the negative than the positive ones for obvious reasons. Okay, and finally, what you're going to have to do is monitor whether you did achieve the results and objectives that you had set up to do. And for this, what we need to do is measure, measure, measure. If you're not measuring it, you don't know if you're achieving your goals. So make sure that, like I said before, you have clear, concrete goals and that you have defined some metrics that enable you to check whether you're doing a good job or not in your decisions. And then you feed back to the beginning and you go again.